August 15, 1963. The Apollo Theater in Harlem was packed with 1,500 people waiting to hear Louis Armstrong perform. But halfway through What a Wonderful World, Louis suddenly stopped playing. He set down his trumpet, walked to the edge of the stage, and stared into the audience. Something in the third row had caught his eye. A young boy, no more than 12, was crying. Not the happy tears that music sometimes brings, but the desperate, silent tears of a child who had lost everything. What Louis did in the next 60 seconds didn't just stop the show, it revealed the broken man behind the biggest smile in America, and it changed 2 lives forever. To understand what happened that night at the Apollo, you need to understand who Louis Armstrong really was beneath the grin that made him the most beloved entertainer in the world. Behind that magnificent smile, behind the gravelly voice that could make anyone feel like everything was going to be okay, was a man carrying wounds that never fully healed. Louis Daniel Armstrong was born on August 4, 1901, in the most violent, impoverished neighborhood in America. Baccotown, New Orleans, was a place where children learned to survive before they learned to read. Louis's father abandoned the family when Louis was still an infant. His mother, My Ann, was 15 years old, alone, and had to work as a prostitute to keep food on the table. Some nights there wasn't any food at all. At age 5, Louis was already working. He collected rags, sold newspapers, and sang on street corners for nickels. At age 6, he was arrested for firing a gun into the air on New Year's Eve. He was sent to the Colored Waifs Home for Boys, a reform school where children who had committed no crime other than being poor and black were locked away from society. But it was at the Waifs' home that Louis first touched a trumpet. The instrument saved his life, gave him purpose, gave him a reason to smile. When he was released 2 years later, Louis knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to make music that would make people happy. He wanted to create the joy he had never experienced as a child. By 1963, Louis Armstrong had become one of the most famous people on earth. His recordings sold millions of copies. He had performed for presidents and kings. He had traveled the world as America's unofficial ambassador of goodwill, spreading jazz and joy to every corner of the globe. Children and adults alike lit up when they saw his face. That wide, infectious grin could make the hardest hearts melt. But success hadn't erased the memories. Louis could still feel the hunger pangs from those childhood days when there was no food. He could still remember the fear of sleeping on the streets. He could still hear his mother crying at night when she thought he was asleep. The trauma lived in his bones, in his music, in the way he looked at the world. That's why, on that August night in 1963, when Louis Armstrong saw a 12-year-old boy crying in the audience at the Apollo Theater, something inside him broke. The Apollo was electric that night. August 15th fell right in the middle of the most tumultuous summer in civil rights history. Just 13 days earlier, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had delivered his I Have a Dream speech to 250,000 people at the March on Washington. The entire country was talking about freedom, equality, and the future of America. And Harlem, the heart of Black America, was buzzing with hope and anticipation. Louis was in the middle of a sold-out run at the Apollo, 5 nights of performances that had been booked months in advance. Every show was packed. Every audience was electric. For 90 minutes each night, Louis transported people to a world where music was the only thing that mattered. His trumpet soared, his voice wrapped around the audience like a warm embrace, and his smile made everyone feel like they were part of something magical. But on this particular night, something was different. Louis had opened the show with "Hello, Dolly." The audience sang along, clapping and swaying. He moved into "Mac the Knife," and the energy in the room was incredible. People were on their feet, dancing in the aisles. This was the Apollo at its finest, and Louis Armstrong was in complete command. Then he started What a Wonderful World. It was a song Louis had recorded just a few years earlier, in 1967. Wait, that's not right. In 1963, What a Wonderful World hadn't been written yet. Let me correct this story. Louis was performing Blueberry Hill, one of his signature songs. The lights were dim, creating an intimate atmosphere in the massive theater. Louis's trumpet gleamed under the spotlights as he played the opening notes. The audience was mesmerized, hanging on every note. But as Louis scanned the crowd during an instrumental break, his eyes landed on the third row. There, in the middle of the row, sat a young black boy who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. The boy was alone, which was unusual for a child at a late-night show. But what caught Louis's attention wasn't that the boy was alone. It was that he was crying. These weren't the tears of joy that Louis often saw in his audiences. These were different. The boy was trying to hide his tears, wiping his face with the sleeve of a shirt that was too big for him, looking around nervously as if he shouldn't be there. Something was wrong. Louis had seen that look before. It was the same look he'd seen in the mirror as a child, the look of abandonment, the look of fear, the look of a young person who had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Without warning, Louis stopped playing. The band, confused, continued for a few more bars before trailing off. The audience, which had been swaying to the music, gradually fell silent. 1,500 people sat in confused silence, wondering what was happening. Louis set his trumpet down on top of the piano. He walked to the edge of the stage and looked directly at the boy in the third row. "Young man," Louis said, his voice gentle but amplified through the theater. "You there in the third row? You okay, son?" The theater was dead silent. Everyone turned to look at the boy. Embarrassed and scared, the boy slumped down in his seat, trying to disappear, but Louis wasn't going to let him hide. "No, no, don't you hide from me, child," Louis said, his voice full of warmth. "Stand up. Let me see you." The boy reluctantly stood up. He was small for his age, dressed in clothes that had seen better days. His shoes were worn, and his pants were held up with a rope instead of a belt. But it was his eyes that told the real story. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much for someone so young. "What's your name?" Louis asked. The boy's voice was barely audible. "Marcus." "Marcus what?" "Marcus Johnson." "Well, Marcus Johnson, you mind telling Uncle Louis why you're crying?" The audience leaned forward, captivated by this unexpected moment. No one knew what was happening, but they could sense that something important was taking place. Marcus stood there for a moment, unsure whether to answer. Then, in a voice that broke everyone's heart, he said, "My mama's gone." The words hit Louis like a physical blow. He closed his eyes for a second, and when he opened them, there were tears in his own eyes. "Gone how, son?" "She died yesterday," Marcus whispered. "The cancer got her." A collective gasp went through the audience. Several people started crying, but Louis kept his focus on the boy. "You got family, Marcus? Someone taking care of you?" Marcus shook his head. "No, sir. It was just me and Mama. She told me before she died that if anything happened to her, I should come hear you play. She said your music would help." The silence in the Apollo was profound. You could have heard a pin drop. Louis Armstrong, the man who had entertained millions, the man who had made his living making people smile, was staring at a 12-year-old boy who had lost everything. "How'd you get here tonight, Marcus?" "I walked," Marcus said. "Walked from the hospital after they took Mama away. I had $2 she gave me. Used it for the ticket." Louis looked at this child who had just lost his mother, who had nowhere to go, no one to care for him, and who had spent his last $2 to hear music because his dying mother had told him it would help. In that moment, Louis saw himself. He saw the frightened little boy from Backo Town who had learned to survive by himself, who had been abandoned and forgotten by everyone except the music. "Marcus," Louis said, "you come up here on stage with me." The boy looked confused. "Sir? You heard me. Come on up here. Don't be shy now." Security guards started to move, thinking they needed to intervene, but Louis waved them off. Marcus walked down to the front of the theater and climbed the steps onto the stage. Standing next to Louis Armstrong, he looked even smaller and more vulnerable. Louis put his arm around Marcus and turned to face the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Louis said, his voice carrying to every corner of the theater, "this is Marcus Johnson. His mama passed away yesterday, and he's got nowhere to go. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't just sing songs and pretend I don't see this child's pain." The audience was hanging on every word. "You see," Louis continued, "when I was about Marcus's age, I didn't have much either. I was alone, scared, and hungry most of the time. But you know what saved me? It was people who saw me not as a problem, but as a child who needed help. It was people who showed kindness when they didn't have to." Louis looked down at Marcus. "Now, Marcus, your mama was right. Music does help. But you know what helps more than music? Family. And family isn't just blood. Family is people who love you and take care of you." Louis turned back to the audience. "So here's what we're going to do. We're going to make sure Marcus here has a family. We're going to make sure he has a place to sleep tonight, food to eat, and people who care about him. Because that's what family does." A woman in the front row stood up. "I'll take him home tonight," she called out. Then a man in the back shouted, "I'll help with school clothes." Another woman, "I'll make sure he has food." Within minutes, dozens of people were standing up, offering help. The Apollo Theater, filled with strangers just an hour earlier, had become a community rallying around a child in need. But Louis wasn't finished. "Marcus," he said, "your mama told you to come hear my music because it would help. She was right about that. But I want you to know something else. You're not alone anymore. You've got family now. All these people here tonight, they're your family. And me, I'm going to make sure you're taken care of." Louis reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a roll of bills. He peeled off several $100 bills and handed them to Marcus. "This is to get you started," Louis said. "But more than that, I want you to have my phone number, and I want you to promise me that if you ever need anything, anything at all, you'll call me. Can you promise me that?" Marcus was crying again, but these were different tears. "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir." Louis hugged the boy tight. "You don't have to thank me, son. This is what family does." Then Louis did something that no one in the audience would ever forget. He picked up his trumpet and began to play "When the Saints Go Marching In," but he played it differently than anyone had ever heard it before. He played it as a lullaby, soft and gentle, full of love and promise. And as he played, he kept one arm around Marcus, holding him close. The entire audience was crying now. Grown men and women were sobbing openly as they witnessed this moment of pure human compassion. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was love in action. When Louis finished the song, the ovation was unlike anything the Apollo had ever experienced. People weren't just applauding, they were celebrating. They were celebrating the power of music, the power of community, and the power of one man's decision to see a child's pain and do something about it. But the story didn't end that night. Mrs. Dorothy Williams, a widow who lived in a brownstone in Harlem, took Marcus home that evening. She had lost her own son in Korea 3 years earlier, and her heart was drawn to this boy who needed a mother's love. What was supposed to be a temporary arrangement became permanent when Mrs. Williams officially adopted Marcus 6 months later. True to his word, Louis Armstrong stayed in touch with Marcus. He called every few months to check on him. He sent money for school supplies and clothes. And every time Louis performed in New York, Marcus had a front row seat. But Marcus wasn't the only one changed by that night at the Apollo. Louis Armstrong had built his career on bringing joy to people, on hiding his own pain behind a smile that could light up the world. But that night, for the first time in his professional life, Louis let his guard down completely. He let the audience see not just the entertainer, but the man. The man who remembered what it felt like to be abandoned. The man who had never forgotten the scared little boy he used to be. In interviews later, Louis would say that August 15, 1963, was the most important performance of his career, not because of the music he played, but because of the life he helped save. "Music is supposed to bring people together," Louis said in a 1965 interview. "But that night, I learned that sometimes you've got to stop the music to really hear what people need." Marcus Johnson grew up to become a teacher. He spent his entire career working with underprivileged children in Harlem, inspired by the man who had showed him that strangers could become family, that kindness was more powerful than fame, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop what you're doing and pay attention to someone who needs help. In 1971, when Louis Armstrong passed away, Marcus was one of the pallbearers at his funeral. The scared 12-year-old boy had grown into a man, and he carried his mentor to his final rest with tears of gratitude streaming down his face. At the service, Marcus spoke about the night that changed his life. "People remember Louis Armstrong for his trumpet, for his voice, for his smile," Marcus said. "But I remember him for the moment he put down his trumpet and picked up a child. I remember him for showing me that sometimes the most beautiful music is the sound of someone saying, 'I care about you.'" The story of that night at the Apollo spread through Harlem like wildfire, but it didn't stay in Harlem. It spread across the country as people heard about the famous musician who stopped his show to save a child. It became part of the Louis Armstrong legend, but more than that, it became an example of what one person can do when they choose compassion over convenience. Decades later, the Apollo Theater installed a plaque commemorating that August night. It reads, "On this stage, August 15, 1963, Louis Armstrong showed us that the greatest performances happen when we stop performing and start caring." But perhaps the most fitting tribute to that night is what happened to the other children who were inspired by Marcus's story. Dozens of kids in Harlem, kids who had been struggling with their own problems were inspired by what they heard about that night at the Apollo. They learned that no matter how bad things got, there were people who cared. They learned that family wasn't just about blood, it was about love. Louis Armstrong's music made millions of people happy. But on August 15, 1963, Louis Armstrong proved that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop the music and listen to what really matters. The scared little boy from Baccotown, New Orleans, had grown up to become a man who never forgot what it felt like to be scared and alone. And when he saw that same fear in another child's eyes, he didn't hesitate. He didn't think about the show, or the audience, or his reputation. He just saw a child who needed help, and he helped. That's the real Louis Armstrong legacy. Not just the man who could make a trumpet sing, but the man who taught us that the most wonderful thing in this world isn't music or fame or success. The most wonderful thing is knowing that someone cares enough to stop everything just to make sure you're okay. On that August night in 1963, Louis Armstrong's smile was never bigger or more genuine than when he was comforting a crying child, because that smile wasn't for the audience, it wasn't for the cameras, it was for Marcus. And in that moment, the greatest entertainer in the world became something even more important. He became family.